There we go. Great. So as I mentioned, we are the Rich Earth Institute. I'll just briefly introduce who we have in the room here today, and then we'll get going with this because we've got a lot to cover. So I'm Julia Kavicki. I'm Rich Earth's Education Director. And here today also we have Arthur Davis, Gretchen Savison, Abe Noe Hayes, and Tatiana Schreiber. And then we'll also be joined by three of our farmer partners that we worked with this past growing season, John Jannison, Jesse Markson, and Eric Cornell. So you'll get to hear their direct experiences with using urine as a fertilizer as well. We'd also like to thank in particular for this research project, our research assistants, Jennifer Minard, Ella Ball, and Cole Taranis, who helped with various aspects of the research. So today we'll be covering a bit about our most recent farm research project, fertilizing with urine, on 2 different farms. And then we'll also be providing a brief overview of a lot of our past research as well, covering a brief summary of some of the various different projects we've trialed, including both technical components and some of our social research also. And a lot of this research has been funded by the USDA SARE project. So that's primarily what we're going to be focusing on. And we're really grateful to the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program for funding so many of our research projects over the years. So just as a brief overview, the Rich Earth Institute is a research and demonstration nonprofit dedicated to reclaiming the nutrients from our bodies in a life-sustaining cycle. And our mission is to engage in both research, education, and technological innovation to advance the use of human waste as a resource. So why focus on urine nutrient reclamation? Well, there are 3 kind of core pillars of why we focus on this work. One is to access the nutrients in our waste to create a local sustainable fertilizer source for local farms. The second is really to prevent nutrient pollution, because when we flush our urine downstream, a lot of those plant available nutrients end up fertilizing harmful algal blooms and contributing to nutrient pollution in our watersheds. And then there's the third sort of additional benefit of being able to save water, where instead of flushing our urine with large amounts of clean potable water, we can conserve that water for other uses. So really the backbone of our program is this demonstration project where around 230 urine donors contribute their nutrients so that we're able to pasteurize it, sanitize it, and provide it to local farms to use as fertilizer. So urine as a fertilizer, here's just a brief overview of the actual nutrients that are in urine. It is largely a nitrogen fertilizer. You can see the NPK value here that we've calculated based off of Rich Earth's community scale program from testing we've done from the urine we've collected, where it has about 0.6, 0.1, 0.2 as an NPK value. But you can see here, in addition to those 3 core nutrients, it also has a wide range of other micronutrients. So it can really act as more of a complete fertilizer than just synthetic fertilizers you buy at the store. So just a few slides here to briefly cover one of the core questions that comes up a lot when we talk about using urine as a fertilizer, which is what happens to the pharmaceuticals in our urine? With our conventional linear system, we know that just as the nutrients travel down a line and accumulate in downstream water bodies, so too do the pharmaceuticals in our waste, which often pass straight through wastewater treatment plants and end up having negative effects on the aquatic life that lives downstream. So when we reclaim urine as a fertilizer, it's a good way to protect those aquatic ecosystems, but of course raises new questions about the fate of these pharmaceuticals in edible crops and soil health. So very briefly, a big research project Rich Earth did in conjunction with the University of Michigan, the University of Buffalo, and the Hampton Roads Sanitation District was looking at the fate of these pharmaceuticals in groundwater, soil, and crop tissue. And essentially what they found is that it doesn't seem to be a big exposure pathway for pharmaceuticals fertilizing with urine. And they were using urine that was spiked with very high levels of a range of different pharmaceuticals to measure the fate of the pharmaceuticals in the crop tissue. And basically the finding is that you'd have to eat about a pound of urine fertilized lettuce every day for 1,000 years to ingest the same amount of caffeine that's in 1 cup of coffee. So very tiny levels, but definitely something we're continuing to research, especially around the long-term soil health effect, as we have reason to believe, or we're curious to find out what the effect on the microbial communities in the soil is of fertilizing with urine year after year. And with that, I'll pass it over to Abe to cover some of our prior SARE research.
Thanks, Julia. So we've been working with SARE since 2013, doing a variety of different forms of research, mostly aimed at assessing the practicality and the effectiveness of using urine as a fertilizer in the Northeast, and farms, also gardens, but particularly farms. And we first started focusing on hay as a crop because there's a lot of hay grown in Vermont and in the Northeast. And it also seems psychologically like an easier bridge to start fertilizing an animal feed rather than vegetables or some other human food. Although we think that's also a good idea. We did testing with urine on hay. This photograph of the center strip there, you can see that's a strip where we fertilized with urine, and it definitely had a positive effect on the hay yield and the growth compared to the two unfertilized strips on either side. That was our first year. The following year, we looked at 4 different treatments. You can see in the graph, one is applying undiluted urine, pure urine as fertilizer, also applying urine mixed with water as a fertilizer, no fertilizer, or synthetic fertilizer. And you can see by the error bars that there was really no distinguishable significant difference between the urine treatments or the synthetic treatment. So it's a good substitute for synthetic fertilizer. Next slide, please. One issue with urine fertilizer, though, is that the nitrogen is all in the form of ammonia once the urine has been stored for a while, and that ammonia can evaporate once you apply it to the field. So you can lose the nitrogen and the ammonia into the air. So one thing we've tried is making compost out of that urine, co-composting with wood chips or horse manure or leaf shreds, shredded leaves. And we found that the shredded leaves particularly were very effective at retaining the majority of nitrogen and other nutrients in the compost in a solid form that was, smelled nice. You could store it in a pile. You didn't have to buy tanks to put it in, and it could be applied with conventional equipment. So that was definitely a success in terms of another way to use urine that minimized ammonia loss. Next slide, please. And then we also spent one season testing the effect of different application methods, so different ways of applying urine to hay and measuring the effect on volatilization. And so this setup on the right-hand side, you see all these little plastic containers out in the field. Under each container, we applied urine to the ground in one of these 4 different application methods. Broadcast, meaning that we just spread the urine all over the surface of the grass, a lot of surface area for evaporation of that urine. Band application means we put it in strips, which is how our urine applicator does it. It's a big tank with a boom, with holes in the boom. So as you drive along, the urine trails down in streams, which makes strips or bands along the ground. Then spot application was just putting urine in particular circular locations, and injection was squirting it into the ground. And broadcast, as you can see, was pretty bad. We lost about 1/3 of the nitrogen almost. But band application was quite better. And practically speaking, seemed like it's an easy way to do it that does a good job. Spot application is better. Injection is even better. But even by itself, the band application is a pretty good way to apply. But then we wanted to look at other methods of reducing the ammonia volatilization other than making compost or how you apply it. How could you actually pre-treat the urine to make it less likely to volatilize in the first place?
Right. So last year, we continued to explore these strategies to reduce ammonia volatilization. And one way to do that is by lowering the pH of the material. And one way to lower something's pH is through fermentation, because the biological activity of a fermentation will create organic acid byproducts. And so last year, we conducted a lab experiment to investigate the bioacidification of manure slurry, digestate, and human urine. And all of these soil amendments are prone to ammonia volatilization. So in the lab, we fermented these 3 substrates by adding whey, which is pictured on the screen here. We used whey because it's a carbon-rich waste material that can be sourced locally from the dairy industry in Vermont. And so we tested whey additions at different proportions and at different temperatures. And we monitored the pH over 100 days and saw that it dropped more with larger additions of whey, and it dropped faster in warm environments versus cold environments. And then after these 100 days had passed and the samples had acidified, we measured the ammonia escaping and found that when more ammonia was retained in samples when more whey was added. For example, when whey was added in a 1-to-1 ratio to urine, all of the ammonia was retained. However, adding that much whey may not be practical, and we determined that smaller additions of whey in the 6 to 12% range are still worthwhile and can still retain 30 to 60% more ammonia than controls.
Tatiana?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so also on that same, that's actually not the same project. A different project, we expanded our research to several other crops, including hay, flowers, figs, and a high tunnel, sweet corn, and hemp grown for CBD. And we did observational experiments where the farmers each compared urine treatments on those crops to their usual treatments. So these weren't like rigorous experiments, but they were observational qualitative experiments. And generally speaking, the farmers who did these experiments, they noted no adverse effects, and in most cases, they had the same or better yield and robustness as compared to their usual fertilization practices. They mostly noticed a fairly strong odor when they applied the urine, but they didn't find that particularly problematic, and it dissipated rapidly. And they all felt they would use urine again if the urine fertilizer was available for sale, and they'd be willing to pay a price equivalent to their usual nitrogen-based fertilizers, or possibly somewhat more because of other values that they ascribe to using human urine, as long as it didn't affect their profit margins. And they had many recommendations for further experiments they'd like to do to validate their qualitative observations and to hone their application methods, some of which we have incorporated into the current project that we'll be focusing on next. And in terms of what they'd like to see for the future, they'd like to see quantification of the potential residual microcontaminants in urine, primarily so that they could communicate that to their customers. And they also wanted to increase, that would also help them increase their own confidence in the use of urine. And they also wanted specific written guidance on crop application rates, the NPK values, and the micronutrient comparisons to other fertilizers, and educational materials to share with their customers. And some of that we've also incorporated into the current project. So you can go to the next.
Yeah, so the other part of this, the project that Tatiana just described, it was our first time venturing into using drip irrigation systems to deliver urine to crops. So the pictures you see here are of me interacting with our system that we did up in Westminster, Vermont. It was growing hemp in plastic mulched rows that had drip irrigation lines under them. The farmer we were working with was using a soluble organic nitrogen fertilizer for most of the field, and we just did a couple rows with urine. So we injected urine using a pump into the drip irrigation line when he was running it, and that was kind of the basis for which we started our work in doing drip irrigation work. We did a couple things with the more kind of controlled experiments that we did here at Rich Earth. We both were trying to look at the differences and the effects on clogging of mixing the urine and the irrigation water versus kind of putting in the urine in one kind of plug. So the idea is trying to mix it as little as possible with the irrigation water. And we did some experiments using different waters of different hardnesses, so different mineral contents, to see if there would be, more or less clogging. I won't go too much into the details, but we determined that you have to have pretty hard water for you to get significant clogging, which some people do have. And so we're looking, part of the current research that we're doing with the current project that isn't quite done yet, so we're not going to report on it today, but is looking kind of further into that question. And so that gets us to our current project, which again was looking at doing furthering our drip irrigation work that I just talked about, doing 2 on-farm experiments that we're going to talk about next, some social research following up on some questions that have come up in previous SARE funded research projects that we've done. And then one of the other, and the kind of the final product that we're kind of working on with this project is to make a guide that we can use for farmers, that we can give to farmers who are interested in using urine as a fertilizer. We can talk about application methods, general information, what kind of crops to use it on, et cetera, to make it as easy as possible. So we'll get into some of the things we did with this current project. We'll play a little video here. This video shows our kind of, small scale setup that we did with John Janison, who's here. And this shows the system we used. So the tractor, you can see the tractor's rolling along, the urine is coming out, and then it's being immediately covered up by the cultivating tines as we go down the road. That was quick. Let's just play it again just because it's really fast. So we have that tank on the back of the tractor. It's going to come, the urine kind of comes down from that white tank to this hose there. You can see it's dropping the urine into the row right next to the corn, and then it's getting covered up immediately. And the covered up immediately is important because then we're not losing that ammonia to the air. So that was pretty neat, and it was kind of following up on what we had done before. You can go to the next one there, Julia. The main part of this, Michael asked a question about application rate. We were aiming for basically to match the application rate of nitrogen that that John was using in the rest of the field. And John, maybe you can speak to that in a moment. But the main part of the experiment was to look at using concentrated urine versus straight urine. Both have been pasteurized, but one we had dewatered using our freeze concentration method, and we kind of wanted to look at how that worked practically in the field. So the concentrated urine, the idea behind that is that we don't have to be transporting as much water from processing facility to the farms, our spin-off company, Brightwater Tools, has been working on a piece of technology to do this efficiently. So yeah, go on to the next one. So this is some of the results that we had from tissue sampling, corn leaves from the field. The nitrogen results are pretty similar. You can see between the urea treatment, the urine treatment, and the urine concentrate treatment rows. Obviously also a lot higher than the nitrogen content in the control treatment row, which obviously wasn't given nitrogen. So that's an expected result, but also it's kind of nice to see that there's not really any, it doesn't appear that there's any kind of like big downsides from the urine concentrate versus the urine. They're pretty similar in terms of the tissue nutrient content. And yeah, I would say maybe at this point I'll pass it off to John. If you want to just talk a little bit about your own experience, and yeah, welcome, John.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I guess I'll start from answering that earlier question on the rate for urine on the side dressing.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah, I believe we were shooting for like, I think it was 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Something like that, between 60 and 90. I think
60, somewhere between 60 and 80.
60 and 80, yeah, something like that. It's different in each field, but I believe it was somewhere like that. So it just, as you could see, it was really coming out. So you needed a lot of water, especially with the unconcentrated stuff, to get that rate up to where it needed to be. So, you know, it was, I found that like just using the undiluted urine, you'd need a big tank to do an acre of corn. So that was, I think last year, no, the year before, or was it 2 years ago that we did the initial trial?
It was either 2 or 3. It might have been 3 years
Yeah.
ago.
I think it might have been, yeah, it might have been 3. Yeah, we had talked about maybe trying to find a way to concentrate it just to make it a little more efficient in that map. But all in all, it was pretty easy. I mean, you know, it was really Arthur did all the work of calibrating and figuring out the speeds. So, and for me, I just had to just go at a normal rate. I just told him what speed I usually go at, and he figured out the rest. So it was
Yeah, I
pretty
think
pretty easy.
one of the downsides to this system is that it depends on tractor speed, consistent tractor speed to get the right application rate. And so one thing that we're looking at in terms of our next steps working together is to try to put together a system using a pump that is like a roller pump that would be directly tied to the speed of the tractor. So if the tractor slows down, the pumping rate goes down. If the tractor speeds up, the pumping rate goes up, so that it's more the pumping rate is tied to the distance traveled rather than just a consistent gallons per minute kind of thing. So that would be a really, I think, big jump in the practicality of the system. That idea came from John. So thanks for coming up with that one.
Yeah.
John, before we talk a little bit more about it, I also wanted to, as part of this project, we also did site visits with each of the farmers, and I went out and talked to John towards, well, it was in October, but it was prior to the full development of the corn, and there were some things that you noticed at the time that I just wanted to ask you about. But first I wanted to just ask you if you could say a little bit about your reason for getting involved in this project. What motivated you to want to participate?
Oh, I don't know. I'm just interested, like any kind of regenerative thing. I like the fact that you guys are doing this, and I'm very interested in what it was all about when Arthur came and talked to me about it. And yeah, I can't really say eloquently, I guess, but I just thought that you guys are doing a good thing, and if I could participate in any way, and I'd be more than happy to do that. Really, I just thought this is a nice direction to go with things, and if I can be a service, that'd be great.
Well, yeah, and it wasn't, yeah, it was very interesting for us to be able to see this, how this worked. And I remember you also saying, just basically that the idea of taking something that we think of as a waste and having it be useful was also important to you. But let's see, somebody asked in the chat here, is the unconcentrated urine just straight up urine, or is it diluted with water or something else? So Arthur says the unconcentrated it's pasteurized, which we do at the Rich Earth Institute, and it's pasteurized straight urine. So unconcentrated and undiluted. So when I visited in October, you noted that, as it says in the slide, that the control leaves looked a little bit yellower than the urine concentrated, and the ears were a bit less filled out at the tips. Also, John, if anything is not correct here and you remember something different, feel free to say so. But the ears were a little less filled out at the tips than the urine treated or regular corn. And the urine treated corn seemed greener and the plants were a bit taller. And you had mentioned that that was possibly due to more sunlight in those rows. And also we noted that at that point, it looked like the concentrated urine treated plants were not as tall on average as the unconcentrated. And they were also a little behind the regular urea treated corn. I was actually curious if you remember if that evened out later on, or if you still noticed any difference.
I really didn't notice much of a difference. You know, I recall by the time I got to picking that corn, the birds had really had their way with it, so I didn't get a lot out of there. But it's tricky growing along a tree line like that. There's you know, a lot of places for birds to kind of hide away on, so it's pretty you know, they tend to peck more at the stuff along the tree line. So but I didn't notice any difference when we did get in there and started picking. So they must have just caught up. And
Right.
yeah,
We could go to the next slide, I think. These were just a few other things that you had noticed at that site visit. You were thinking that you might want to use even more urine in the future, just to see how the plants would react to that. Trying urine under plastic with different crops. And this was an interesting thing that you had noted less pest pressure in the urine treated plants as compared to the conventional. But you thought that maybe that was not really due to any deterrence from the urine, but rather that the conventionally treated corn grew faster, so the pests were drawn to it faster, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah.
And also, let's see, you said that, you know, it's pretty clean stuff if it's not being taken out of a sewage treatment plant. So you thought you think of human urine fertilizer is pretty much equivalent to another source of nitrogen. We have a question in the chat about talking to the public about the corn and if it's opened any new conversations there that benefit or not your business. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
yeah, I've had a little bit of discussion. It's not something because it's on such a small scale. It's not something I've really put out there much, but I'm not something I'm ashamed about or something. But yeah, I mean, I'm firm believer of it. I think that, you know, this is a good direction to go. So, you know, if someone was, you know, if someone's to bring it up or ask about it, you know, I'd be pretty positive about it. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I do carpentry in the winter time, and carpenter that I was working with, I told him I had to take the morning off to do this webinar, and I told him what it was about, and he's like, "Ooh, really?" And so I had to explain it to him, but it was funny that you know, you're still going to get that reaction from anybody, you know. But I figure, you know, you gotta head that off and kind of control the narrative on some things, and a lot of people, once you talk to them about it, it's like, you know, they come around to it, and it's not that big of a deal. So yeah, I don't see it as a problem, really.
Yeah, and the one thing you mentioned at that meeting, yeah, we'll move on to the next one shortly, but the one thing you mentioned at that site visit was that you had some concern that people might confuse it with biosolids, which urine is not a biosolid because it doesn't go to a treatment plant. It's diverted prior to a treatment plant. But some concern that customers might, you know, confuse it in that way. But just the last question is, how would you imagine urine just ideally being used on your farm? Or a farm like yours?
Yeah, I mean, using it with corn it's pretty easy. I could see using it more there. I think it's just I'm not totally set up for using liquid fertilizer for side dressing on my equipment, but I have some farms that I do business with elsewhere that are set up for that sort of thing, and I got to look at their equipment. One of them was like a roller pump, and another setup was with a electric pump, and it was really easy. Actually, the one with the electric pump, the guy did it in under $200 in material, and it was like simple. And there's some advantages to it. One thing they said they loved when they went to using liquid urea, it was just they didn't have to lug around bags, just that bulk of like hefting bags, moving it around. It was just easy. They could just pull up with a big tank in their truck and just in the back of their truck, and then just bring the tractors to it and pump it in and keep going. And it wasn't like, they weren't throwing their back out, lifting stuff up over their heads to fill up hoppers and things. So I thought that was appealing. Yeah, I mean, I think, I think I will start to go in that direction anyways. And being so close to Rich Earth and their product there, I think, this might be a good relationship.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. And, we're going to have, the webinar is scheduled for an hour, but people are welcome to stay longer after that for, about 15 more minutes to ask questions. So we'll have time at the end for more question and answer. So, okay, we'll move on.
All right. So the next project that we worked on was with Yellowbud Farm down in Northfield, Massachusetts. And Jesse and Eric and the rest of their team grow nursery seedlings of primarily nut trees, some other trees as well. They can talk more about that in a moment. But so we were very excited to work with them. They have a very cool vision of perennial food production in the Northeast, which is very inspiring. And so for their nursery operation, they were really excited to work with us and work with us in the future, using urine to grow their nursery seedlings that they grow from seed to then have enough growth to be able to then sell those seedlings to folks who are going to be planting out trees such as chestnuts and hickories, which are the two main species that we worked with this past year. We both did application to their big in-ground beds, which you can see in this picture, as well as a more controlled experiment on some kind of raised air-pruned beds that you'll also hear about in a moment. But without further ado, I'd love to introduce Jesse and Eric and give them a moment to talk about their experience and with the project. Jesse and Eric, welcome.
Yeah, we're really grateful to be not just part of this project, but in relationship with Rich Earth Institute. I'm pretty unrestrained for my love for what you guys do. And just to give a little bit of an intro, yes, thank you, Arthur. That's correct. We focus on perennial staple crops and cropping systems, so things like chestnuts and hickory for staple starches and fats, as well as other trees that drop for reducing the need for imported livestock feed, as well as their value in shade and shelter. So that's a little bit of an overview, and some of the values that we have in coming to that nursery is we are not certified, but we're I guess beyond organic, and part of what that means to us is not just obviously avoiding any types of pesticides or herbicides, but we also felt very strongly about not wanting to use any synthetic fertilizers, thus being so drawn to urine diversion and use as a fertilizer. And I'm so into using urine as a fertilizer because use it and pay attention. You know, it works so well. And I had been using urine in mushroom cultivation when I first met with Arthur and Abe at a gathering in Putney a few years ago. And it had just incredible results, even at relatively small quantities with mushrooms. And so in this transition of working more focusedly on our wholesale nursery and leaving the mushroom business behind, it's done nothing but kind of increase my adoration for this whole process and application. Yeah, and this year was just another incredible example under our belt for observing both in some kind of quantitative fashion with our air-prune beds and some qualitative fashion and anecdotal in our in-ground beds where we did not have controls. But the results were astounding with the growth that we had. A few years ago, I had been growing persimmons for a few years prior to that, and we had done a diluted application just in a personal small bed, not for production, just with our own supply, so to speak. And the growth rate on the persimmons we did have a control, not with any rigor of assessing soil, existing soil nutrient and moisture and so on. But the seedlings were about 5 times, over 4 times the size in our urine applicated than the kind of control at that time. And so clearly we are doubling down further in use. And so what you're looking at right now is a video that Eric could speak more to about how the application process went in the field.
Yeah, you can see our high crop tractor, and luckily we were very gracious that Rich Earth allowed us to use their applicator tank. It worked fortuitously perfectly with our bed diameter, our bed width. And so that was a 500-gallon tank. We did a 2 parts water to 1 part urine, so 33% urine application. And we went through 1,000 gallons on 17 400 to 450 foot seedling beds, which was really exciting. As you can see, we applied after leaf out. So this was first, second week of maybe third week of June. So early in the leaf, that didn't have any real negative effects, which was a good observation. Our target was so 37.5 gallons, so 12.5 gallons of urine per pass, and we'd go one way and then come back the other way to account for, there's a slight slope in the nursery and just wanted even application. So we did 25 gallons per bed, and we did that twice. So each bed got approximately 50 gallons. And we monitored the flow rate and the speed of the tractor, and there's a little bit of variation in the lengths of beds, and we dialed it in, and it was really fun, and we were able to do it typically right before rain. So the weather really was just absolutely perfect because there was moisture on the ground when it was applied, and then it got rained in. So we really there was no application into like a dry surface, which really helped the infiltration and the absorption. And yeah, and we grew some really great trees.
We had one of the highest so after growing season happens and we dig a bed, we go through a grading process where we assess a handful of different characteristics. Maybe the most commonly talked about one is, height of the above ground biomass, stem height. But that's one of the many different characteristics that we look for in what we grade as sellable or A grade. And so caliper, root biomass, and so on are really important things to us as well. So when we go through that grading process, we can understand a rough percentage of how many trees are of a sellable quality. And this year we had the highest concentration that we've had, and it's the first year that we use significant application on our infield beds. So even without control, we can observe a pretty significant benefit to our system.
Yeah, it is really beautiful to demonstrate that this is urine for fertilization. So it's been really exciting to share that with people and to see the response in showing that this is possible and just how tangible a way it is to close our resource loops. And it's a double positive because we're growing better trees and we're diverting urine out of our waterways.
Yeah.
So really excited to continue with this work.
Yeah, being part of nutrient cycling is something that's really important to us. It just also happens to be that it's just an incredibly effective use of our resource. Sorry, Tatiana.
No, that's okay. I put a few things from our site visit that we did on here on the slide, so you can see some of the things that you all had said. You know, a reason for doing it, which you've already kind of explained, but you know, I just really loved the quote that you had said, you know, that it's important to interact with the landscape as co-creators, not as aliens on a foreign land. That was kind of a nice way of putting it. And in terms of the planning process with Rich Earth, you mentioned that you had kind of, again, used that word co-created, but co-created a plan with us with the different trial plots. And then Abe, you said Abe obviously advocated for more replication plots to have a better understanding. So that was done in the seedling plots and or the air pruned plots. And then in terms of using on the nursery trees, you mentioned, I think, that you didn't have a control for that, but that it was very apparent that the trees did really well, and that you were curious to do a more rigorous study on that. But you think that you've proven the concept that it's a viable use for the material. And in terms of feedback from others, that seems like I didn't get it all on the slide there, but generally the feedback was positive, although I think you said that people sometimes were more positive about the idea of using it on trees than something like a leafy crop like a lettuce.
Right. And to clarify, I personally would use it on, depending on how the application was, on something like spinach. Just to clarify on that quote, I was just thinking of more public perception barriers.
Yeah, right. What people sometimes say to you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talk more about the more quantitative SARE-funded research. Right. Wonderful.
The next part.
Yeah. So now, right, I'll talk a little bit about the more controlled urine fertilization trial that we conducted in the air pruning beds on butternut hickory seedlings. So in this experiment, we applied urine at 3 rates to these trees. There was a high treatment group, which received 0.13 liters of urine per square foot, a low treatment group, which received half of the high amount, and a control that was unfertilized. And so these doses were split between 2 applications. One was before germination in June, and the other later in August. And the urine was diluted with water and applied using a watering can. And immediately before and after this application, the beds were lightly watered to ensure that the urine would soak into the soil. And then in November, actually go back. In November, we collected data on how these seedlings grew. And before we look at that data, I'll just mention that Eric and Jesse found very practical differences in the tree quality between these groups when they were sorting sellable trees versus not sellable trees. About half of the high dose group were deemed sellable, whereas only about 3 trees total in the control and low treatment groups combined were. So now we'll look at the data. So here we have 4 plots, one for each type of measurement that we took. So there's stem height on the upper left, stem base diameter, which is how thick the stem is right above the soil. the root diameter, and the wet mass of the plant. And so for each of these growth parameters, there's a bar representing the average measurement for each of the treatment groups, control, low, and high. And we performed an analysis of variance tests to determine any statistical differences between these groups. And so the bars marked by different letters were found to be significantly different from each other. So you can see for stem height and mass, there were no differences, but for stem diameter and root diameter, we found that the control treatment group was significantly lower than the high treatment group. And that data supports the more qualitative results experienced by Jesse and Eric. But it doesn't quite reflect the super dramatic results that they were seeing, which indicates that maybe there are other growth parameters that at play that we did not measure, or that maybe we didn't have a large enough sample size to really detect these significant differences. Yeah.
If I could just speak to that for a moment, our speculation on why we didn't see as dramatic of effects. Well, I think this is a wonderful proof of concept that's showing that there is meaningful benefit even at what I would consider a very low application rate. We didn't, of course, going into this, know that how low of an application rate is. We're kind of just trying to get our bearings of what the numbers are per unit of space or seedlings and so on. But my understanding or my speculation is that the dramatic effects will definitely be observed if we use much higher application rates in the future. I think that if we were to do it again, I don't even know if I would use the quote unquote high. I think I would start maybe even double what our high was, particularly working with hickories that are, I guess, known somewhat widely in the nursery trade as a challenging tree to propagate. It's from our observations over the past few years is they're pretty hungry feeders. And so that's just our understanding at this point. But even with the low dilution rate, just as you can see, I think with a quote that was maybe 1 or 2 slides ago, we were just saying that there was a significantly higher percentage of sellable seedlings in that 2x group, application group. Yeah, even though, as I'm saying, it feels like maybe a little less than even what a starting point would be if I were to do it again, which is great. We really learned from this experience. I think have a finer understanding of what would make sense to trial moving forward.
Yeah, maybe a 4x and an 8x, something like that. I'd be interested to push the limits to see, yeah, where is that line? How much is possible to apply?
Okay, thank you. And again, there'll be some time after for more questions to ask the farmers. So thank you. This project also included what we call dialogue groups, which are conversations with consumers who buy local food, mostly from farmers markets or from farm stands, or are members of CSAs. And we plan to do 3 dialogue groups. We've done 2 with consumers, mostly recruited from people who go to farmers markets. And we have 1 more to do, which will be mostly people who are members of CSAs. And we're just at the, we haven't really analyzed all this data yet. So this is just beginning kind of analysis. But from that, the initial reactions were mostly positive. People were excited or curious about the possibility of using urine as a fertilizer, although, as this person said, learning of urine separation and it's being decoupled from industrial processes and industrial fertilizer, that seems amazing, and that we weren't already doing it on a much larger scale. But people did have some concerns mostly about infrastructure needs. They'd like to see a life cycle analysis of the energy and transportation costs of these kinds of systems. But mostly people really liked the idea of diverting urine from being a waste to being a useful resource. And one person said, you know, it sounds great compared to all the other things we could be doing with it. But this quote, "Are we doing the right thing in order to do the right thing?" was kind of a response to this idea of wanting to understand the full life cycle analysis. So you can go to the next slide. Just a couple more things in terms of, we asked people if they were familiar with other fertilizers that farmers use on their, you know, as compared to urine, and people were aware that they don't really know all that much about the compost manures and other fertilizers that farmers normally use. But one person said, "What I know about the world of synthetic fertilizers is just that it's like one of the most energy intensive processes you could find. It's a big part of our carbon footprint." And we also asked people about labeling, what words they like to use, like pea cycling, urine diversion, urine diverted fertilizers, or UDFs. And it seemed like people had different, when we usually do this, we get different people have different ideas, but one person said, "I like pea cycling because, like recycling, it puts it in the going green category." But another person said, urine-derived fertilizer speaks to a process of a raw material that creates she said she thought that that language created an inherent trust because it talks about the pathway through which it becomes something that can be applied. So that pathway from a waste to a resource. And that person felt that that seemed easier to accept. You can go to the next slide. So we also are doing interviews with buyers, people who buy produce or other agricultural crops wholesale directly from farmers. So we're trying to understand what their concerns would be so that we can communicate that to farmers. And there are 4 buyer interviews proposed. Only 1 has been done so far. And that person, so again, it's very preliminary, but that person said, had an interest in it, said to me, it would be almost a better alternative than just chemically derived nitrogen or man-made synthetic stuff. To me, that is just worse. And now I'm a little more comfortable with it after hearing about the sanitation methods that we use at Rich Earth. That person did mention that having urine certified or organic would be very helpful. Without that, that person would want assurance of when it was applied, how it was applied, that there was no residue on the plants, but would have fewer concerns about non-edible crops. In terms of labeling, that person was very mixed about whether we even need a label, given that most agricultural crops are not labeled. And this was also a very mixed responses in the dialogue groups as well. Whether a label at the point of sale would be a good thing, a bad thing. But this person said that at the same time, you know, a reason to have it would be kind of groundbreaking, and feels that in time it would be accepted. And this person also felt that having pamphlets in the store, or at least to be able to give to customers, would be really helpful. To be armed with the knowledge so I could pass it on to the customer, that would be awesome. And minds would change. So those are just some comments from buyers. Okay, going on, I think Abe.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Sorry, we're still on the farm guide slide.
I can hop in.
Oh, I happened to, sorry.
Yeah, so just to wrap up with a few things here. So based on a lot of the findings from our prior farm research, and then also what we've been finding in the social research, we're compiling all of that together in a farm guide intended to support folks in other areas where urine fertilizer might increasingly become available in using urine as a fertilizer on their farms. So this is just an outline of what that guide will include, and we're really interested in getting feedback on the guide. So if you want to learn more about that, definitely get in touch with us. And just real quickly, 2 of the regions where urine fertilizer is very excitingly to us becoming available, or hopefully becoming available outside of Rich Earth's immediate area in Brattleboro. One is in the northern region of Vermont. Wasted is a portable toilet business that's collecting urine from their portable toilets and providing it to currently 1 farm partner, but I think they're interested in other farm partners in the Lake Champlain watershed. And interestingly, up there, because of the phosphorus pollution, urine fertilizer can perhaps provide sufficient nitrogen on lands that have extensive phosphorus buildup from historic manure or compost application. So it has a kind of unique, interesting application in that region. And then down in Cape Cod, a lot of partners have been working on getting a urine diverting pilot going. And the permitting for the use of the urine fertilizer on farmland there is still underway. The regulatory pathway is in progress for being figured out, but we have faith that eventually there will be urine from this pilot project available to farmers in the future. So with that, we have a few questions for discussion. We'd also love to hear if any folks in the audience have questions they'd like to ask. You can raise your hand now to ask our farm partners or us. We'd love to hear your thoughts about all of the info we just presented. And a huge thanks again to John, Jesse, and Eric for coming and joining us today. We're really grateful to have you. Bring us back together so we can see each other here.
Oh, yeah.
And also, let's see, we have a question to John. How long are the beds? How long were the beds that you were using?
Okay. Yeah, I think they were like 300 feet. The rows were, and then I do 16 rows in a block. That's just one field. All my fields are different, but in that application, I believe there's somewhere around 300 feet. And I think it was, what was it, like 80 gallons? Arthur, do you remember how many gallons per row it was?
Well, there's about, I mean, that tank is about 80 gallons.
Yeah.
That we had on the back of the tractor. And with the straight urine, we were using most of it per one row. But with the concentrated urine, we were getting probably almost 3 rows.
Yeah.
With one tank full. So that's
I think we might have got 2 rows. Now I'm thinking, I think we might have went down and back, right?
With the straight urine.
With the straight
that makes
urine.
sense. Sorry, I'm kind of thinking before we got back to the tank. Yeah. So down and back, and then we probably were able to do then 4, at least 4 down and backs.
So it's like 600 feet for 80 gallons.
Yeah.
Give or take.
Yeah. Right, and our per acre calculation was then made by the taking into account the row spacing. Taking into account row spacing and speed of the tractor, and then the measured flow rate of liquid out of the tank, which we just did a measurement to figure out what that was, and and then be able to change it enough between the two. Dial it back for the concentrated urine to allow the tractor to be going the same speed that it wanted to be going with. There's another question here about, Tatiana kind of answered it in the chat, but just so other people can hear it. There was a question about what nutrients are in urine. Primarily, it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, primarily nitrogen. So we tend to apply urine to meet the nitrogen needs of the plants, because if we were trying to meet other nutrient needs with plants, in general, we would be applying way too much nitrogen. But it does have a decent amount of phosphorus and potassium, and also much smaller amounts of secondary nutrients, of a whole host of secondary nutrients.
Earl, do you have a question you'd like to share?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Do either of these application experiments know the pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet that was applied?
Can figure that out for you. The yellow bud, there was a pounds of nitrogen application rate of 50 pounds per acre. Was that the standard? Then the 2x was twice that. Is that how it works?
I don't
Okay.
know the numbers off the top of my head.
Okay. In our notes, we have 50 pounds per night of acre per 50 pounds per acre is the one figure we have, which
Okay.
was half a mile an hour. So I'm not sure what that works out to, but I think in the range of 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre probably covers it for all of these trials.
Okay,
And
great.
divide 50 by about 40 and you get pounds per 1,000 square feet. So around a pound or two per 1,000 square feet.
Okay, the reason I ask is many uses of fertilizer for trees, shrubs, gardens, flower beds, lawns, always end up saying 2 pounds nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And that's the number that we've been using to suggest to people that they can or should use and no more.
Well, that would mesh pretty closely then with the if I'm reading this spreadsheet correctly, the larger amount on yellow bud.
Okay, and the real reason I'm asking is that on the Cape here, some people would like to use urine and their own properties as fertilizer, but we think that Mass DEP is opposed to using any urine on the surface of the ground. And we want to come up with a rate of application which we would consider low enough that the urine would be absorbed by the soil and the plants and not go down into the groundwater, which always comes up. They say, well, if you put it on the ground, it's going into the groundwater anyway. So what's the difference?
Yeah, the difference is, mathematically speaking, the difference is what's taken up by the plant.
Yeah,
that's a nice equation. And actually, I'm seeing now that it looks like we had 35 and 70 pounds per acre of nitrogen on the air pruned beds.
Yeah.
And that what you applied on the in-ground beds was 50, I guess, what you were shooting for.
I think
so. Okay, so we did 35, 50, and 70. So yeah, we're definitely under the 2 pounds that you were suggesting just now, Earl.
Robert, do you-
Before we get to Robert, there was a question in the chat. I just want to make sure it gets answered. Someone asked John why he applied the fertilizer after the corn was a little bit growing rather than before planting.
Yeah, so yeah, typically you want to give corn a shot of nitrogen just before they need it most, and usually it's around the 6th leaf stage. And that's kind of the point in their growth system where they suck up a lot. They need a lot of nitrogen for growing tall and setting fruit and stuff. And before then is not very efficient. You have a chance of damaging the plants because they're not going to use that nitrogen, and you'll lose some of that urea to not urea, but some of that nitrogen to to run off and whatever else. And then later than that is just not as it's a little bit more difficult to get equipment over and stuff. So that's why we do it then.
Right, that makes sense. Robert?
Yes, well, thank you for the excellent work of your presentation. It was quite interesting, and I did a bit of a conversion of dimension in the square meters just to have my idea of what is high, low, and control with your test. And it seems realistic. Actually, in Europe, we tend to apply under 3 liter per square meter, and 2 to 3 liter maximum of urine per square meter. So your number are very close to those. They come to 1.4 liter per square meter, which is probably a lot for a single application. If you can split the application, maybe it will be more profitable for your crops to split the application. But all the ideas I saw was quite interesting, and the idea to apply the urine just before it rains, we do the same here, and it works very well.
I can just jump in, Earl, we just did a little bit of math, and just so you have it in the units that you were wanting, it looks like we applied, the low end of what we did was about 0.8 pounds
That's right.
of N per 1,000 square feet, and the high end of what we did was about 1.6 or 1.7 square pounds per 1,000 square feet.
Great, thank you.
So, about half to a little bit under the
Yeah.
two that you were talking about.
That's good.
I'll add that I think it's really important to have application rates put into whatever cultural contexts are being employed. So in our personal context, in saying that we thought we could use a lot more, it's really important to note how we prepare beds or how we have been planting. One important aspect of that is we deep mulch, and so we have generally at least 2 inches of partially composted wood chips on top of all of our beds. And so when I think that even with that understanding, the numbers that are being proposed as highs and lows, I think make a lot of sense. I think we would probably, in our context, push for closer to that 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet. It seems like in the future, given what we've observed. But appreciate those points being brought up. It's definitely something that we've kept in mind, is making sure that we're making the best use of our resources, not just to the obviously important goal of making sure nothing gets to a point of contaminating groundwater, but also just maximizing the health of our plants, which I think coincide well.
Also for Yellowbud, we had a question in the chat. Someone asked if, I don't think you've done this yet, but would you be concerned that trees might become dependent on urine and struggle when transplanted into a wild area or for reforestation?
No, I don't. I think actually, given the size of root mass, as well as the colonization, we didn't speak to kind of all the different cultural practices we used here, but we inoculate all of our trees with applicable or known symbionts of mycorrhizal fungi. The root biomass is really significant in the trees that we're growing, and I think that if you think about all the conservation nurseries or state nurseries, they're using really significant amounts of synthetic fertilizers that even though I don't promote those practices, you can transplant those trees and they can grow and adapt to a different context in their rhizosphere wherever they go. How well a tree adapts to one context in a nursery setting and then where they go out, I think is something that we could certainly use a lot more research on. But our observations of growing trees with urine and then seeing them be planted out in a different context do not indicate that they're in any way that the urine fertilization is a detriment to their adaptability to their next home.
Earl, did you have a question or response to that?
Yes, this is one for Abe. People here on the Cape said, well, how do you know that nitrogen doesn't go down into the groundwater if you put it on at a certain rate? And in your experiments, you did some tests where you grew vegetables with urine fertilizer, but you were looking at pharmaceutical removal. But in fact, you measured the water that went down under the crops through the soil and fell out the bottom into the groundwater. Do you have numbers about the nitrogen in versus the nitrogen that eventually went down ultimately into the groundwater?
Yeah, that wasn't something we were monitoring for total nutrient runoff purposes, but I could look back through it and see if we have the right figures to be able to give you that kind of conclusion. I think we probably do, because we measured nitrogen level in all the water. We measured how much water came through.
Okay. Well, that would be really useful, because it doesn't seem to be known how much nitrogen gets passed a grass lawn
Yeah.
or vegetable garden or anywhere.
Yeah, and I know that there's some test cells set up at Mass TC that could be used for that as well, which would probably be really popular with Cape Cod folks to do it on Cape Cod with Cape Cod soils and conditions. So that might be something in the works already. You could talk to Brian about that.
Oh, that's good.
We realize it's we're past noon here. We can all at least the Rich Earth folks can stay on and answer questions if other people have questions. We understand if you have to go as well. So thanks for your time.
I also wanted to ask, or you could put it in the chat, for people, this would just be for people in the local area, but if you had a suggestion for other buyers of wholesale who buy directly from farmers, who you think we should interview, you could put that in the chat. That'd be great. And, we're working on this guide and the farm guide. We have a draft. We'll be getting that out to some reviewers shortly. But if there's anything you feel would be very important to put in the chat, to put in the guide, you could also put that in the chat.
Yeah, and just there've been a few questions about this in the chat as well, but I'll say it to everyone. Also, we've been recording this webinar and we'll be sharing a copy of the recording with everyone who registered afterward, along with a copy of the slides, so you can go back and review if you missed anything, or share it with others that you want to share the word about. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. It was really great to share all this with all of you.
Thank you. Au revoir.
Oh, we got a couple more. Let's see.
Bye.
All right.
Well,
All right.
with that, thank you all so much for coming, and we look forward to being in touch, and look for an email from us in a day or two with the recording.
Bye, everybody.
Again, John, Jesse.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Good
you
to
all
see you,
so
John.
much.
Good to see you,
Everybody,
Jesse and
thanks,
Eric.
John, Eric, and
Thank
Jesse.
you.
Take care. Bye.
So much
Bye.
gratitude.
Take care.